Let's get started. So welcome to our first departmental seminar of the academic year, and my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Brian Earp. So Brian did his Ph.D. at Yale in both experimental psychology and philosophy under supervision of Molly Crockett and Joshua Knoop. Brian also has master's degrees from Oxford and from Cambridge. He's currently a senior research fellow at the Uehiro Centre for Practical Ethics here at Oxford. He's also an honorary member of this department and JRF at Brasenose College, and he co-directs the experimental bioethics lab in Oxford, where he combines approaches from experimental psychology with concepts from moral philosophy and bioethics. He also co-wrote a book on love drugs, the chemical future of relationships, which sounds very exciting. As a neurophysiologist, I would probably argue that the future of our relationships is electrical rather than chemical. But yeah, and he will talk to us today on moral, relational morality.
Thanks. Well, thank you for the very nice introduction. Thanks to all of you for being here, and to all of you who are online as well. I hope you can still hear me. I'll be speaking about relational. I'm going to talk about how social relationships shape moral judgments. These are with my collaborators, all of whom are at Yale. Some of them have moved on. Molly Crockett's at Princeton now, so that's why I have Yale here. This was published recently in Nature Communications, and I'll walk you through some of the main findings in this paper and also discuss some follow-up work that hasn't yet been published. So anybody who's dipped into the moral psychology literature really any time in the last 10 or more years will have noticed that there's this preponderance of permutations of so-called trolley problems, where this has been the main paradigm that's been used to try to examine how it is that we make trade-off decisions or respond to moral dilemmas. But these are kind of unusual in that they represent a type of situation that very few of us ever find ourselves in. So even if this paradigm is a legitimate way to draw certain inferences about human moral cognition, and there are some critiques suggesting that maybe it isn't, but even if it is, it would only tell us about a small fraction of our moral cognition in everyday life. Maybe first responders who go into a building and have to make an emergency decision whether to save 4 people or 1 person. I mean, so it's not that it doesn't apply to anything, but you know, one-off interactions with strangers take up a very small proportion of our moral judgments. The vast majority of our moral judgments happen in sort of everyday situations. You know, so-and-so cheated on someone and you have an attitude about that and you talk to their friend or whatever. I mean, these kind of almost gossiping appraisals that we make of each other is where the bulk of our moral decision-making is embedded. And it's within particular relationships, not with strangers whom we encounter in a crisis, but with people we know and will probably want to interact with again. And therefore, the sort of diachronic nature of our relationship has to be taken into account, not just I see you once and then you disappear. So the main motive for this project is to try to bring moral psychology together with insights from relationship science and see if we can explain a greater amount of variance in our moral judgments and psychology. Now, there's a small but quickly growing literature that demonstrates empirically that one and the same action may be judged very differently depending on who's involved, who's doing it to whom or to whom it's being done, and the nature of their relationship. So we're certainly not the first to try to carve out some of this space. Just to give a very straightforward everyday example, imagine that somebody fails to feed another hungry person whom they could easily feed. Now, how wrong is that? It seems like it really depends on the nature of the relationship. So if that's your own child who you're failing to feed, I think most people in most cultures would judge that to be very wrong or neglectful. But if it's a non-paying customer at a local restaurant, then failing to feed them free of charge might not be judged as wrong or wrong at all. And so just asking how wrong it is to do something, you can't really even get that off the ground until you tell me more about the relational situation within which it's occurring. So you can zoom out and ask this question more widely. Well, what types of relationships are there? How should we characterize these languages that we normally pick out with ordinary lay language? You know, boss-employee, teacher-student, parent-child, sibling. These are words that we use, but these relationships vary across multiple dimensions. So which dimensions should we look at? Some early work has characterized relationships like these in our lives in terms of the genetic relatedness of the interaction partners. And just to follow through with that idea, you can see it would explain our different intuitions about this dummy case I've provided. So, the parent-child relationship is typically a kin-based relationship where there are clear evolutionary reasons why it is that we would be inclined to help our kin and maybe judge people for not doing so. Whereas a customer-seller relationship typically is not a kin-based relationship. So, this genetic relatedness criterion could help us draw some distinctions in this space that are relevant to our moral judgments. But there's other ways that relationships vary. These two constructs come from the relationship science literature. One is social closeness. I'll explain technically what these mean later. Interdependence is another element, and you can sort of see that a parent-child relationship is a socially closer and more interdependent relationship than a typical customer-seller relationship. And so using this framework, you can also explain at least this one example. Some interesting work more recently has suggested that we should think instead of the different kinds of cooperative functions that different relationships serve in our lives. And so an example, a characteristic or predominant function that's served by a parent-child relationship is one of care, where somebody is responsive to the needs of the other person without keeping track of who owes what to whom in a kind of tit-for-tat or transactional way. So non-contingent responsiveness to needs is a cooperative function that's characteristic of this relationship, whereas a customer-seller relationship is sort of modeled on a norm of transaction, where I'll only help you if you give me a benefit of equal or comparable value in return. So the existing work has been one-to-one. It's chosen various relationships in our lives, like the parent-child relationship, and said that's basically a caring relationship. But of course, the parent-child relationship is many things. It's also a hierarchical relationship, especially if the child is very young. And so we thought that it might be fruitful to think of the multiple cooperative functions that are served by, or in some sense embedded within, our representation of the different social roles in society. And also, it's not going to be all or none. Different cooperative functions are served to different degrees, characteristically and in different contexts within a given relationship. And we wanted to measure that and then use that to make predictions in a separate sample about the moral judgments people would make within those contexts. So our research question is, how do the multiple functions that are served by a given relationship guide moral judgments for different actions that happen within that relational context? And how does our account compare with the more predominating ones in the literature to do with genetic relatedness, social closeness, and interdependence? So just to summarize our hypotheses, we expected that different relationships will normatively serve different cooperative functions to different extents. And whatever the population level norms are for what those cooperative functions are, we're going to call relational norms, just for shorthand. Our prediction then is that the relational norms of a given society, and of course you'd expect these to vary between societies, the common model of a parent-child relationship in one society might have different norms embedded within it or change over the life course in different ways in different societies. These norms should predict between relationship variance and moral judgment within that culture regarding attitudes toward someone behavior, as in the example of failing to feed a hungry child. And again, we wanted to first build our model and then use it to make predictions in a separate sample, not just lay a model on top of some pre-existing data. And finally, we expected or hoped anyway that our model would do better than existing models. And as a preview, that's what we find, but I'll come around to that at the end. So the first step, if we want to put this model forward, is to make some kind of measurement about what these relational norms are in at least one culture. And we started out with the United States. So we took a nationally representative sample of participants in the United States. And we taught them about these things called cooperative functions, sort of translating technical theoretical terms into lay language while preserving as much of the content as we could, where basically this is a culturally prescribed, mutually beneficial solution to a recurrent coordination problem of human social life. And I'll just give you some examples of very common coordination problems that our species will have had to contend with throughout the long history of our being around. Maybe not with this particular dessert, but in a limited resource situation where I have two individuals who have equal standing or status or power or claim on the resource, they can either fight each other, which is not typically going to be in either of their best interests, or they can choose some sort of reciprocity solution to that problem where they share the pie or they take turns using the resource or whatever it may be. And so this is just objectively a better solution to the problem than fighting, typically. And it makes sense that it would be rediscovered and culturally encoded and passed down generation after generation. Now, if you have two individuals who have unequal power or status or claim on a resource or strength, it's still not in the best interest to fight. One person might win the fight, let's say, but having some norm of deference embedded within an expectation of hierarchy might solve this problem. So, for example, you see this throughout the animal kingdom. Elk lock horns and bellow at each other and figure out who's bigger. And the reason for doing that is so they can avoid fighting. Because once it's clear that this person's bigger person, then the other one will sort of slink away, and they'll both avoid fighting for that day. So many animal species, including ours, have situations within which a norm of hierarchy helps us establish who owes what to whom or who should do what in that situation. Another really important problem that has to be solved by our species to continue is to keep vulnerable offspring alive. And if all you had available was a norm of reciprocity, a kind of tit-for-tat relationship with your newborn, let's say, the newborn wouldn't do very well. So that's not going to cut it. Instead, you're going to need something like what we've been describing as care, non-contingent responsiveness to the needs of the other without expecting some specific benefit in return. Finally, to create an offspring, you have to solve another coordination problem, which we just refer to as mating. In every society, there are certain relationships that are prescriptively allowed to involve mating, and others where mating is disallowed, and that varies from culture to culture. There's also a norm involving how to coordinate group behavior, which we refer to as coalition. This comes from the work of Daphne Bugenthal, who theorizes all 5 of these functions, but we focus just on these 4 because these concern dyadic or 2-party relationships, whereas coordinating group behavior would just involve a different paradigm to try to measure the norms that are pertinent in that situation. So our question is, how are these norms actually embedded within people's expectations for the different relationships in their lives? And we just go out and ask people. So we had participants from this nationally representative sample take 20 common relationships and rate each one of them on how much each one should ideally serve each of those functions, if the relationship were functioning as well as it could for a relationship of that kind. And I'll just show you how these results come out. What this leads to is a kind of 4-dimensional relational norm profile, kind of a fingerprint for each relationship in terms of how we intuitively expect things should go based on these cooperative functions embedded within the relationship. And so this is just a sample. These aren't all 20 relationships, but take the sibling relationship. Pink is for care, and you can see that's sort of dialed up right around near the top. Reciprocity is also pretty high here. This is mating, which is negative and down at a floor effect, so people don't think the sibling relationship should be a mating relationship. And then hierarchy is all over the place because it depends on if one sibling is maybe older than the other. That's going to be a bit of a wash. So you can see each relationship here has a different kind of intuitive representation of what's going on within that relationship in terms of how we expect the other person to treat us and how we should treat them. Now, we didn't want to use all 20 relationships for our subsequent studies because we were going to use a between subject design and we needed to pare things down as much as possible. So what we wanted to do is to try to see how these different relationships cluster in this 4-dimensional relational norm space, so that we could just pick some examples from each cluster rather than having redundant examples of relationships that are basically serving the same purpose. And so by picking this subset of relationships, we would then test our hypotheses for moral judgment predictions that I mentioned earlier. So we did a power calculation based on a sampling method to ensure 95% confidence and a 5% margin of error in these measurements I'm about to show you. This is a different way of representing the data I showed you a graph of earlier. Participants were asked to use a scale from -100. It definitely should not serve that function to +100. It definitely should serve that function if it's working as well as it could. And again, this is just some examples. You can see in the stranger relationship, a lot of these scores are somewhere near the middle. You sort of don't know exactly what to expect, but it predominates with reciprocity. With the stranger, it's like, I'll help you if you help me, but I don't have any particular care obligation toward you. Romantic partners you see are very different. You have reciprocity representing here kind of equal status between the partners is expected within this sample. Care is maxing out at the top, and mating, I guess, as you'd expect. We also had a friends with benefits relationship. We thought that might be represented a little bit differently. So you see somewhat less expected to serve the mating function, less care-based than a romantic partnership, and reciprocity over here. So you get the idea. There's just the different patterns of results for each of these. So this would be the entire distribution represented of scores for each of those relationships. Now let's go back to our parent-child relationship that we started with respect to the example of failing to feed another individual. Well, you can start to see how these two relationships are different in very specific and subtle ways. So you can see the extent to which the customer-seller relationship is characterized by an expectation of care compared to that of the parent-child relationship. And you can also see how they differ in terms of a reciprocity expectation. So what this allows us to do is then to make relatively fine-grained predictions. Instead of saying, well, this is basically a caring relationship and this is basically a transactional relationship, we can model exactly how much each of these things is expected to do each of those things. And we can also account for the fact that, one and the same action may have multiple effects. For example, failing to show care to your romantic partner might also affect your, the ability of that relationship to serve a mating function, let's say. So one and the same action could have multiple effects. And unless you're modeling all four of those dimensions, you're going to miss out on a lot of that variance. So as I said, we were trying to identify which of these relationships clustered together in this relational norm space. And in order to do that, you have to figure out how far apart they are from one another along some dimension. And you might think you could just take a mean rating of how much the relationship is on average expected to serve some function and compute a different score with each other relationship. The problem is that a lot of our distributions here are obviously non-normal, and so the mean would be very misleading. The mean would be, here, but that doesn't tell us really what's going on with the full distribution. And a similar thing going here, where you have, a non-normal distribution. So what we ended up using was the Kolmogorov-Smirnov coefficient, which allows us to compare the difference in two shapes of two different distributions, accounting for all of the information encoded within that shape, rather than just reducing that to a mean. Many of you are probably familiar with this kind of analysis, but for those who aren't, it's useful for these kinds of situations, so I'll just briefly explain how it works. This is not our data, this is just an example. For any two distributions, if you want to come up with a quantification of how unalike they are, you can replot them as cumulative distribution functions like this, and then you basically measure the widest point between them. And the idea is that if two functions were exactly alike in their shape, then they would never really diverge from each other if you plot them on a cumulative function. But if they are different in their shape, you can get a sense of just by how much by taking that measurement there. And so that's the coefficient. What we did then is we computed the mean, I'll just say KS instead of Kolmogorov-Smirnov from now on, between each relationship and every other relationship. And you get a matrix table like this, where you can see in terms of an average KS distance in relational norm space, how far apart is any relationship from any other relationship? And then you can enter those data into a hierarchical clustering analysis to see then how the relationships are organized. I won't go through the details, but this is the result of that analysis. So as you can see, friends with benefits and romantic partners kind of stand alone as mating relationships. They're the only ones that we studied that are expected to any extent to serve that function. You can see hierarchical relationships in gray here, so boss employee and teacher student. These are caring relationships, primarily in pink. And then the rest of the relationships are predominantly characterized by a norm of reciprocity. And so we could just select a subset from each cluster to use for the next study. Okay, I'll take a sip of water and then I'll explain what we're doing with this next study. We wanted to ask people how wrong it is to do various things. And so we needed to come up with some things to ask them about. And what we did is we trained judges to understand what we meant, again, by these definitions of the functions we were using. And we had a large pool of actions, and we said, we want you to rate this action on the extent to which it would characteristically impair or violate each of those functions that we mentioned. And so example items that went through this filtering process would be for care, person A sees person B crying and walks away from them. The idea is that would characteristically weaken the care function in a situation where you don't actually know who's involved in the interaction. This is just a kind of generic claim, an average expectation. For hierarchy, person A refuses to follow a reasonable order from person B. For mating, person A refuses to have sex with person B. Person A decides not to return person B's nice favor as an example of reciprocity. Again, part of what we're trying to do here is to get away from science fiction scenarios or trolley problems or emergencies or crises and talk about the everyday moral judgments that we make as we just go about our business. And so these are really mundane examples that don't elicit very strong reactions necessarily. And so if we're able to predict variance, even in these very modest cases, as opposed to having to search for extremes, then that would, I think, speak further in favor of the strength of our predictive model. So we ended up having 3 items for each function with 12 overall. Now, we recruited a new sample of participants, and we have a between subjects design, so we have a much larger sample size here. What we did is we assigned each participant one relationship by random assignment, and then we asked them to say, how wrong would it be within this relationship for each of those 12 things to happen? So we're getting 12 ratings from each participant for one relationship each. And as you remember, our prediction was that, well, here's one way of saying what we predict. We predict that as far apart as any 2 relationships are in their relational norm profile, that should correlate with how far apart those relationships are in terms of how bad it is to violate those norms. So that's our first prediction, is that the distance in relational norm space should correlate with the distance in moral judgment space. We also tried to directly predict moral judgments using a linear regression model, where the idea is that the cooperative norms from study 1 would directly predict sample 2 moral judgments. And in this kind of a model, we could control for demographic information we collected, as well as a measure we took of just how likely each of these actions is to occur. And I'll explain why we wanted to be able to control for that. Let's see, do I have it here? Maybe I explain it later. I explain it later, so I'll come back to that. So here's our first prediction and the result confirming it, and I'll show you how to read this chart. On the x-axis is based on the KS coefficient of distance between any 2 relationships. So to illustrate, BE is the boss-employee relationship, and RP is the romantic partner relationship, and each one is colored based on the color of the cluster from which it came in the hierarchical clustering analysis. And they are maximally far apart from each other in terms of the cooperative functions they are normatively expected to serve. So, they're highly different from each other in terms of the mating function, highly different from each other in terms of hierarchy. And so you can see why they would be, out at the margins here. And what that shows too is that how wrong it is to, for example, fail to go on a romantic date with a person or something like that is going to be very different if the person is a boss-employee relationship or if the person's a romantic partner. So you can see that that correlates very strongly with how far apart those relationships are in terms of how bad it is to do each of those things. On the other side, you have the father-child and mother-child relationship, which are almost indistinguishable in both respects. So they're actually, we're not statistically distinguishable from each other in terms of the relational norms they're expected to serve. We thought there might be some gender differences based in care, for example, based on gendered stereotypes about the prescriptive roles for men versus women. In this particular sample, we didn't find that. And similarly, it's equivalently bad to do each of those things, depending on if you're the father or the mother in a relationship. And so that's why that's down on the other side. You can also see what this looks like from a function-specific angle. So rather than using the mean KS distance, this is just looking at each function one at a time. So you replicate the result just looking at care, just looking at mating. Mating, you can see, clusters very heavily. Hierarchy, we found the correlation as well. And for reciprocity, we didn't. And this puzzled us. We think we have an understanding of why we were not able to successfully make this prediction. And so, as we're closing up, I'll come back to this and let you know about some new data we have to try to address this question. So here's where I explain why we wanted to collect the data on action likelihood. One reason is because some of the sentences for some of the participants, depending on what relationship they were assigned, are going to lead to some very strange or uncomfortable situations. where part of their reaction to it might just be that's not a thing that should happen, or it's not a thing that does happen. And part of the second descriptive term that's important there is that some of these reactions might just be due to a sense that something violates a social convention without it necessarily having anything in particular to do with cooperative functions being frustrated. And so if we don't have a sense of what the baseline expectation is of how likely this thing ever is to happen in the society, we might be conflating variance in violation of a social convention, a mere social convention, so to speak, and violation of, a cooperative norm, which is better characterized as a sort of moral violation. And so what you see here is that both of these factors were predictive in the linear mixed regression model. Action likelihood has a negative coefficient because the less likely something is to happen, the more wrong it's judged to be. But you can see that the relational norms model is something like 80 times larger in the size of the beta coefficient. And so we were convinced that the relational norms was predicting quite a lot of variance above and beyond whatever you get from mere social convention violations. And our squared analysis suggested that 63% of the variance in the sample 2 moral judgments was explained by the sample 1 relational norms. And so the last bit here is just to see how does our model compare to existing models in the literature, genetic relatedness and social closeness or interdependence. How am I doing? Let's see. Yeah, I should be wrapping up shortly. So here we have genetic relatedness, social closeness, which has to do with 3 dimensions that we assess: the mutual understanding, the extent to which each partner accepts and strives to validate the other's nature, and non-contingent responsiveness to need, which you'll notice is theoretically the same as our care function. This is a construct that comes from the relationship science literature, and so you should expect a correlation between social closeness and care, and indeed you find that. Interdependence is a slightly different construct. It has to do with the strength, breadth, and frequency of influence that interaction partners have on each other's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And so we had a third sample of participants go back to those same 20 relationships and rate them on how much they would ideally be characterized by social closeness and by interdependence. The genetic relatedness we just figured out for ourselves. And so we can enter those into a model along with the relational norms predictor and see what happens. We found that genetic relatedness, social closeness, and interdependency, none of them were predictive when relational norms is in the model, whereas relational norms remains predictive with a very, very small standard error here. Just to illustrate this, take the case of genetic relatedness. So suppose you're thinking of the item, person A refuses to follow a reasonable order from person B, which would be a violation of hierarchy. Well, some genetically close relationships are also hierarchical, like the parent-child relationship, but some genetically distant relationships are also hierarchical, like the boss-employee relationship. And so if you just go with genetic relatedness, you'll have no basis for distinguishing those 2 relationships in terms of why it might be similarly wrong to fail to follow the order if you're in the subordinate position. So to summarize, we expected that different relationships will normatively be expected to serve different cooperative functions. That's what we found. They predicted variance in moral judgments in a separate sample, and our predictions were better than the existing models in the literature. So I'll just close with this funny result we got for reciprocity, which puzzled us at first. Similarity in relational norm space did not predict similarity in moral judgment space. So what was going on there? Well, our lay language translation of the theoretical construct was this, that we said the function of reciprocity is for coordinating behavior between people who have equal say in the situation and for keeping things fair between them. Now, here's the romantic partner relationship, and you see it's maxing out reciprocity. So what people are basically trying to say here is romantic partners should be equal to each other. They have an egalitarian model of the power differential within romantic partnerships. Now, it happens when you're in a caring relationship and your needs and abilities are roughly equal, you'll end up doing something that looks like reciprocity, like you'll take turns doing the dishes, for example, as a coordination device to figure out who should do what. But importantly, if needs and abilities become unequal, so one of you becomes ill, the other of you doesn't keep track of exactly how many times you did the dishes. Now you do the dishes because that's what your partner needs. Whereas if you're in a customer-seller relationship, the kind of reciprocity that you would have in that relationship is explicitly tit for tat. It's contingent giving of benefits and receiving of benefits. And so if we can't tell apart a romantic partner relationship from a customer-seller relationship on our model, you can sort of understand why we would get a wash with that reciprocity function. And so we realize we need to distinguish between two types of reciprocity. There's a reciprocity that happens within caring relationships, which is mutual responsiveness to one another's needs, such that if needs and abilities are roughly equal, then you're going to take turns doing the task, but it's not contingent on the other person doing the task when needs are unequal. Whereas there are tit-for-tat contingencies in exchanging benefits and what we are going to refer to as kind of transactional relationships to distinguish them from other forms of reciprocity. Transaction is really explicitly about this contingency in the giving or receipt of benefits. So in our original model, reciprocity and hierarchy were almost defined in terms of each other. If reciprocity is for coordinating behavior between people of equal say, then hierarchy is for coordinating behavior between people who have unequal say. But if that's true, then reciprocity is just the 0 point of hierarchy. It's the function that should kick in whenever it's not hierarchical. In which case, we've already taken a measurement of reciprocity over on the hierarchy dimension. And we realized that maybe we could just drop the reciprocity measures we had originally conceived of it, because that's going to fall out of care, as I said, and replace it with a new transaction function, which is explicitly about these contingencies. So I'll just show you how these results come out. Here's the original finding from our published paper, where these two relationships, as an example, cannot very well be distinguished from each other. When we measure transaction instead of vague reciprocity, you see that they're highly distinct from each other. So the romantic partner relationship is now strongly negatively expected to be transactional, whereas previously it was supposed to be based on reciprocity. So it became very important to distinguish these. And then you'll see that the customer-seller relationship is now much less ambiguously expected to serve this kind of reciprocity, if you want to call it that. So here's our original finding for reciprocity, where we were not able to observe the correlation. And based on some pilot data, that is what I have available to show you now. This is what we get when we use transaction instead for that same result. Interestingly, the clusters come out differently too, based on our current data. So I'll show you those. Here, each of the clusters is really characterized by two prevailing functions. So take the red ones. These are hierarchical caring relationships. So you might call this, kind of a hierarchical care cluster. So teacher, student, father, child, both for young children and older children. But then you have mutually caring relationships where there isn't so much of a power differential like close friends, teammates, and siblings. Here you have transaction-based relationships that are not based on care, but that are hierarchical, like the doctor-patient relationship, where there's uneven knowledge or skill and power within that relationship, or the boss-employee relationship, which is more transactional, but also hierarchical. Then you have sort of mutual transaction relationships, which are all the rest of them. So acquaintances and strangers, neither one should have any more standing than the other to decide what to do. And it's a highly contingent way of relating to one another, apart from helping somebody in an emergency, let's say. So because I'm just about out of time, I'm not going to go through this representation of how we're conceiving of this space, but you get the idea. The more a relationship is based around communal strength, which is similar to the concept of social closeness, the more it should be governed by a norm of care. And the lower the communal strength of a relationship, the less it should be governed by that norm, and the more you would expect it would be governed by transaction. And then the more or less authority differential there is, which is the y-axis here, will predict whether the relationship is meant to be hierarchical or not. So I think that's just about it. Just showing that these results hold up in a regression model if you enter them that way. And I'll just thank a few people very quickly. These labs gave a lot of feedback, had quite a lot of help with statistical and coding consulting. This is a very complicated, large, multi-stage data set. And we had a number of volunteers to do rating of specific stimuli and so forth. So none of this could have happened without all these people. These are my main co-authors, Killian McLaughlin and Josh Monrad. My undergraduate research assistants, Rachel Calcott, Mina Caraccio, and Alexa Owen. And my supervisors, under whom I conducted this work for my PhD, Margaret Clark, who's a prominent relationship scientist, and Molly Crockett, who studies moral psychology. So thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Brian, for this very clear talk. I think you made a strong case for the existence of these relational norms in your data. We have time for questions. Are there any questions from the audience? If not right now, I think Jeff Bird has a question from the chat. Jeff, would you like to?
If I unmute, can you hear?
Maybe Jeff can type the question.
Ah, okay.
Jeff, either unmute yourself and no, we cannot hear. Oh.
Ah.
Jeff can only be heard online.
I think the computer speaker is on mute.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Bottom right. On the bottom right? Here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Jeff, try again.
Can you hear me now? Still not working?
Sorry, I don't know. Maybe Jeff, if you type the question in the meantime, we can take another question.
Yeah. Yes.
Clarification question regarding the third hypothesis. I think so this is what you're saying, that it does better than the alternative models. How exactly did you compare the models? Because I think in one of the screenshots, it looked like the beta value is higher for the alternative model than for the relationship. Can you just clarify that?
Yes, I can go back to the regression table, but the beta value for the relational norms model was 8 times larger than the value for the alternate model, comparing it to the action likelihood thing. So I think you might have swapped the beta values in your memory. But I can go back to that. Repeating the question. So for Robin Murphy, the question was, in comparing the relational norms model with some of the other values, wasn't it the case that some of the other factors were more predictive? Maybe you meant this chart. Okay, so let's take a look. I think the reason why the beta values are larger is because the standard error is huge. So these are not significant results because there's so much variance. Whereas the relational norms model has a smaller beta value, but a much smaller standard error.
So it's rather than through the linear model, rather than direct compare them using Bayesian or some other approach.
That's right. This is the only way in which we've so far compared them, but there might be some other ways that would be good to test for the robustness of the relative relationship. Any other questions?
So Jeff has now very kindly typed his question in. So maybe I can just read it out. Lovely, rigorous investigation and great talk. Thank you. Demonstrated nicely how it goes beyond existing models, but does it go beyond the person in the street? If relationship is such that one believes it should involve, for example, care, then it seems clear it's more morally wrong to not show care. And this seems quite clear. Question mark.
Yeah, so I think if you ask about any function on its own, how bad would it be for a relationship based around care to not show care, then the intuitive response is, well, it'd be pretty bad, given that that's a care-based relationship. But I don't think most of us consciously have a representation of the multiple cooperative functions that are embedded within any given relationship, such that we can make a fine-grained prediction about how wrong something is that frustrates multiple functions at the same time. So rarely is it the case that you have an action, say, failing to show care, if you want to characterize it that way. I mean, the specific action might be something else. It might be just walking away from someone who's crying. And the question is, that's going to characteristically really weaken the care function, but it might also weaken other functions, depending on the type of the relationship it is. And so what we add that goes beyond just asking people on the street is this ability to make a multidimensional prediction and with fine-grained a sense of exactly how wrong it should be judged to be based on those 4 dimensions rather than just a one-to-one mapping.
Jeff has a little follow-up question. Why don't we need to have them consciously in mind unless asked or confronted with the violation?
Right. I mean, we certainly don't need to have them consciously in mind. I think that these responses are typically intuitive and involuntary. You hear that somebody failed to feed their child and you just instinctively think that's not the right thing to do. I don't think it's, they first refer consciously to a model of the cooperative functions embedded within that relationship and then deduce that it's wrong. That sort of computation is probably happening under the hood. It just spits out an intuitive wrongness feeling.
A further question from the audience.
So this is a stable model and you've tested it a few times. Do you think it would be eventually used in cross-cultural samples or just to compare the different participants when making ratings?
Yes, that's exactly what we hope to do. So the first thing we want to do is publish the updated model where we've replaced reciprocity with transaction. So we're working on that. And when we do some further checks to make sure that we really are confident with that second version of the model, then precisely what we'd like to do is to see if it holds up cross-culturally. So what you would expect is between cultures, you should have different relational norms. But within a culture, whatever the relational norms are for that culture should predict moral judgments within that culture. And it also helps explain why, questions about moral relativism. Why is it in that culture it's not considered wrong to do X, Y, or Z, whereas in that culture it is considered wrong? We should be able to predict exactly how differently wrong something is expected to be based on the respective relational norms for each culture. So far, we've only measured them for the United States, but we'd like to measure them with collaborators all over the globe as a future step.
What is the approximate age of participants? Have you thought about maybe doing also a generational divide to explore whether relationships have evolved in the last few years or how younger kids conceive of these relationships? That would be interesting.
Yes, that's a great question. I'm trying to remember if we don't have it in this particular model. So the age of the participants was representative for US demographics from 18 and above. So we have an 18 to 25 group of participants that is representative of the proportion that is in the US population and so on for each group. And so what we could do to answer your question is to come up with some theoretically justified divide between generations, say, among those age groups and see if there's a generational divide in how relationships are represented. That's a great idea.
Kind of building on a similar idea about how these things can be relative. Do you think there's like scope for some level of recursion here? So, for example, if I have a boss who I think doesn't see things as hierarchical at all, and then all of a sudden they turn around and start acting really hierarchically, do you think I would be then more likely to see their actions as wrong because of how I think they see these norms, rather than how I see the norms?
So I don't know what to say about that specific case, but I think you're pointing to something really interesting, which is sometimes we have a mismatch in how we're representing a relationship to how somebody else is. And this can often happen in cases of power asymmetries, where the person in the more powerful role thinks we're just friends, whereas the subordinate person is highly aware of the fact that the other person is in a hierarchical role. And so if we're representing the relationships intuitively differently, I might think it's okay to pal around with you or take you out for a drink or something, whereas you might think it's totally inappropriate. And then we have conflict now because I think I'm just being friendly. Why are you so upset? And you think I'm violating a responsibility I have as the senior person. And so also the representation of roles can change even for a person in context-specific ways. So take the example, I showed you my theater photo earlier. In college, my best friend directed me in some plays. And so while we're in the theater space, I know that he has final say over what to do, even though we're friends. But as soon as we go out of the theater space, if he kept bossing me around, it would be completely inappropriate. Like, you're not doing that right now. That was for that space. So I think this helps explain both changing moral judgments within a relationship if the context changes, and also conflict between people in terms of their representations of relationships.
I had a question as well. How do you think of these relational norms? What's their status? Are they representations in the human mind or the brain? Do you think they are acquired as a package, or could it be that they're useful for accounting for variance structure in the data, but actually they might be broken down, let's say, neurobiologically into different components, for example, relating to some mechanisms that tap into this genetic relatedness or the interdependency relations. Then it's actually a construct which you can identify in the data, but when you look at, for example, the brain or other components of the mind, it might break down differently.
Yeah, so we haven't done an elaborate theorizing on that, but the model from which we're drawing, which was published by Daphne Bugenthal in 2005, attempts to go all the way from neurobiology up through psychological constructs and social contexts and map out some of these things. So as an example, care is going to track depth of attachment. And so insofar as you can measure attachment bonds, the attachment bond between a parent and their child is probably going to be highly predictive of the likelihood that that will turn into a caring relationship. But of course, sociocultural factors can interrupt that possibility. You might have somebody that would be genetically disposed to form an attachment relationship in a certain context, but for whatever reason doesn't. And then you often find that, if they're not following the norm, that there's a conflict between what people expect and what that person is doing. Mating is going to have to do with, libido and the various hormones that govern libido, in terms of, the expectations of the society shaping your own experience of when that's appropriate. I'll just give an example. Oedipus Rex, when he's having sex with Jocasta, has a certain biological response, but when he reframes Jocasta as his mother, all of a sudden his body responds very differently. And so I think there's an interaction between how we're representing what kind of relationship am I in with this person and various neurobiological processes.
For example, just to follow up, parental care, that's something obviously which animals also did display very clearly with now identified neural pathways. Would you identify that as a precursor for a relational norm, or is it something different?
That's exactly what we think is going on. We think that humans have evolved certain dispositions to more readily learn certain kinds of cultural norms. And these cultural norms have also been selected on over generations based on their ability to successfully solve recurring coordination problems. And so there's some relationship between, cultural evolution and biological evolution that makes certain kinds of norms likely to be stable and relatively universal. So as far as we can tell, every culture has a care-based norm, at least for immediate offspring and very closely genetically related others. Every society has some concept of fairness or reciprocity. It might be operationalized differently in a given society, and might even recruit different neural machinery in some cases. But at the level of describing the norm, there's got to be something like that to solve conflicts of interest. Similarly, hierarchies, as I discussed earlier, represented throughout the animal kingdom, including our species. So I think these things have some biological evolutionary component, but I don't want to take a stand on exactly how that plays out for each norm. Yes?
Thinking that have you looked at the extent to which certain types of behaviors might be seen as wrong, not just because they violate a relational norm, but because they may be exploiting aspects of the relationship? So that, for example, if the boss presses younger female employee, the boss to stereotype presses a young female employee to have sex with them, that this might be seen not just as an inappropriate relationship, but that
as a perversion of the norm. That should,
but also that the boss may be using his power to, he might feel that he has to obey him to not replicate the job references.
Yes. So we define the cooperative norm as something that's mutually beneficial. But if it's not mutually beneficial, that's one of the ways of violating the norm. You have the shell or the structure of the norm, but then one party exploits that cooperative expectation for personal gain, and that would be one central way to violate such norms.
Yes, and I was in relation to that also thinking about the fact that it's seen as very, very wrong if parents, particularly parents, seeks sex with their child. And of course, one of the reasons is that it's highly genetically dangerous to potential offspring. But even if one replaces the parent with a step-parent who isn't biologically related, it would be probably seen as almost as wrong because of the exploitation of power and constraining.
Yes, I mean, so an intuitive aversion to incest has often been theorized as coming from a concern, an evolutionary concern for genetic problems in offspring. And so, that's one way you would get some consistency in the mating norm across different societies. Is some of that's going to be very, very much the same. If you have a social role that serves the same function as the role that evolutionarily involves this problem, you can sort of see how the norm, once embedded in the parent role, just gets transcribed over to somebody who's playing a social parent role, even if they don't have the genetic relationship. Yep.
Maybe one final question.
As I understand it, the model derived from like the third person relationships, somewhat a father with a child. Would you expect the model to hold up for essentially self-referent norms? We're all aware that hypocrisy is rife. I'm kind of wondering whether you may be able to, for example, tap hypocrisy and vendors and so on. So would you expect it to be the same, or would you expect it to be different for self-reference judgments?
So you're certainly right that self versus other judgments, especially in the realm of moral excuse making, tend to differ systematically. And I'm not sure how to map that general asymmetry onto each of these particular functions, because I suspect that the logic might be a little bit different in each case. It would just go straight across. Here's an example. So the parent-child relationship changes in its degree of hierarchy over the life course, and in some cases flips, where the child then has to take care of the parent later in life. And I think sometimes people fail to update those changes, and it can lead to these very uncomfortable situations where the kid comes home from their job and they're a professional now, and the parent immediately starts treating them like they're 5 years old, and they are very frustrated about that, or the parent won't accept any help from the child because it just feels like it's against the logic of the function, but that's because they haven't updated to realize that the hierarchy part is meant to be a moving variable. It's not something that's just stuck forever. And I think sometimes people may, exploit the fact that the other person is representing the relationship differently, a little bit coming back to this point, as a way of excusing their behavior, because they can plausibly appeal to the norm as it once was or something like that. They could say, well, you're my mom. Why wouldn't you, treat me in such a way, when what they should be doing is taking responsible for their own behavior. That might be an example of that.
So if you wanted to predict behavior, might be that you would also have to look at self-referent relations.
Yes, I think so, and I'd really be curious to do that. Yeah.
Okay, so let's all thank Brian again for the wonderful talk. Thank you all. If there are any more questions, I'm sure Brian will be able to.
I'm happy to hang out for a little bit if anybody has any questions.